He was the young rebel who promised a fundamental change. With just a handful of men, he launched a guerrilla war to free Uganda from decades of tyranny. He was an intellectual, a freedom fighter, a man who spoke of a new dawn for a nation that was drowning in blood. But now, after nearly 40 years in power, many Ugandans, most of whom have never known another leader, see him as the very kind of strongman he fought to overthrow. He's the president, the general, the patriarch of the nation. His face is a constant presence, his rule an immovable fact of life. So how did the liberator become the ruler? How did the man who condemned leaders for clinging to power become one of Africa's longest-serving presidents? This is the complicated story of Yoweri Museveni, of a nation's hope forged in war, and the slow, grinding consolidation of an iron fist. To understand a man like Museveni, you have to start with the broken country that made him. Uganda, once called the Pearl of Africa, was fractured and bleeding. Independence in 1962 didn't bring freedom. It brought a slow slide into chaos. The first leader, Milton Obote, sowed seeds of division right away. He threw out the constitution, abolished the traditional kingdoms that were the bedrock of society, and centralized power in his own hands. He created a republic in name, but a dictatorship in practice. This first betrayal of the independence dream left a deep wound of mistrust that would fester for years. But that was just the prelude. The real nightmare began on January 25th, 1971. While Obote was away, his own army commander, a towering, charismatic, and terrifyingly unpredictable man named Idi Amin, seized power in a military coup. At first, many Ugandans and even the West were relieved. They hoped for an end to Obote's policies. They couldn't have been more wrong. What came next was 8 years of unimaginable horror. Idi Amin's rule became a global synonym for brutality. His regime was a carnival of death. State violence wasn't just a tool, it was the entire policy. His secret police, the State Research Bureau, became a dreaded instrument of terror, its dungeons echoing with screams. Public executions were a grotesque form of entertainment. Bodies were dumped in the Nile, a horrifying message to anyone who dared to dissent. The death toll is staggering. It's estimated that between 80,000 and 300,000 people were killed during his reign. He purged the army of ethnic groups he distrusted. Intellectuals, journalists, religious leaders. Anyone seen as a threat simply vanished. In 1972, he launched an economic war, expelling Uganda's entire Asian population of around 40,000 people. They were the backbone of the country's commerce. They were given 90 days to leave, their homes and businesses handed to Amin's cronies. The move sent the economy into a catastrophic tailspin. The nation, once a promising post-colonial state, was now an international pariah, its people living in constant, paralysing fear. This was the Uganda that shaped Yoweri Museveni. Born in 1944 to cattle farmers, he was part of a generation that came of age with the promise of independence, only to watch it curdle into tyranny. His education at missionary schools and the University of Dar es Salaam in Tanzania threw him into the radical, Pan-Africanist ideas of the time. He wasn't just a student of political science, he was a student of revolution. Dar es Salaam was a hub for liberation movements, and he allied himself with groups like Frelimo from Mozambique, even getting guerrilla warfare training. He was reading Fanon and Che Guevara, but he was also learning the practical, brutal math of an insurgency. When Amin seized power in 1971, Museveni, then a young intelligence officer in Obote's government, immediately fled to Tanzania. From there, he began his long war. He formed a small rebel group, Fronasa, dedicated to overthrowing Amin. For 8 years, he built his networks and fought in the resistance. His moment finally came in 1979. After Amin made the mistake of invading Tanzania, the Tanzanian army fought back, marching all the way to Kampala. Supported by a coalition of Ugandan exile groups, including Museveni's, they finally toppled the brutal regime. But the fall of Amin didn't bring peace. It just created a power vacuum. The years that followed were a chaotic shuffle of interim governments. Leader after leader failed to unite a traumatized and divided nation. The umbrella group formed to govern was itself fractured along old ethnic and ideological lines. Into this chaos stepped Milton Obote, the very man Amin had overthrown. Backed by powerful figures, he positioned himself for a comeback. The stage was set for the 1980 general election, which was supposed to be Uganda's return to democracy. Museveni, deeply skeptical of the old guard, ran for president himself. The election was a disaster. It was plagued by widespread allegations of rigging, blatantly manipulated to ensure Obote would win. For Museveni, this was the final betrayal. He had fought one dictator, only to see the country handed back to the man whose actions had paved the way for him in the first place. He saw politics as a sham. He famously warned that if the election was rigged, he would go to the bush and fight. The official results declared Obote the winner. Museveni kept his promise. The ballot box had failed. He would now choose the bullets. On February 6, 1981, Yoweri Museveni and a tiny band of about 40 followers, with only 27 guns between them, launched a desperate attack on the Kabamba military barracks. Their goal was simple: seize weapons and declare their rebellion. The attack wasn't the success they'd hoped for. They failed to capture the armory. But it was a declaration of intent. It was the birth of the National Resistance Army, or NRA. From these humble beginnings, Museveni built his revolution. He and his men retreated into the dense wilderness of central Uganda, an area that would become known as the Luwero Triangle. This region was home to the Baganda people, who had suffered terribly under Obote's first rule and were furious about his return. Here in the swamps and forests, Museveni, the intellectual, became Museveni, the guerrilla commander. The NRA was a different kind of army. Drawing on his studies of revolutionary movements, Museveni knew a war couldn't be won with guns alone. You had to win the people. The NRA's mantra was to be like a fish swimming in the sea of the population. They weren't occupiers, they were liberators, and they had to act like it. Museveni enforced a strict code of conduct. His soldiers were forbidden from looting. They paid for their food. They treated villagers with respect. This was a dramatic, shocking contrast to Obote's government soldiers, the UNLA. The UNLA, made up mostly of soldiers loyal to Obote, treated the people of Luwero with extreme brutality. They saw every civilian as a potential rebel sympathizer. They burned villages, destroyed crops, and committed unspeakable atrocities. In their attempt to drain the sea to catch the fish, the UNLA unleashed a wave of terror that, instead of crushing the rebellion, drove thousands of desperate people straight into the arms of the NRA. It's estimated that anywhere from 100,000 to 500,000 civilians were killed in the Luwero Triangle, a horrifying chapter that cemented Obote's legacy of bloodshed. While the UNLA terrorized, the NRA organized. In the zones they controlled, they set up resistance councils, or RCs. These were basically village committees that acted as a local government, settling disputes, distributing aid, gathering intelligence. This was a revolutionary act. For the first time, rural Ugandans were given a stake in their own lives, a taste of the democracy they'd been denied at the national level. This political network was just as important as any military victory. The war was a long, grueling slog. The NRA rebels, often in rags and poorly armed, survived on their wits and the support of the locals. They specialised in surprise attacks, ambushing patrols and raiding police stations for weapons before melting back into the bush. Key figures rose alongside Museveni, men like his brother Salim Saleh, and a disciplined young Rwandan refugee named Paul Kagame, who would one day become president of his own country. By 1985, Obote's regime was rotting from the inside. The same old ethnic rivalries were tearing his army apart. In July 1985, two of his own generals overthrew him. Obote fled into exile for good. The new military junta in Kampala was weak and disorganised. They tried to negotiate a peace deal with Museveni, but he had no faith in them. They were part of the same corrupt system he was fighting. He used the ceasefire to regroup and rearm. In January 1986, the time was right. The NRA launched its final offensive on the capital, Kampala. The battle lasted for days, but the demoralised government army quickly collapsed. On January 26, 1986, the NRA marched into Kampala, not to silence, but to the cheers of a jubilant crowd. A few days later, Yoweri Museveni, the 41-year-old guerrilla leader, was sworn in as president of Uganda. Standing on the steps of Parliament, he made a promise. "This is not a mere change of guard," he declared. "This is a fundamental change." For the people of Uganda, it felt like hope had finally arrived. In the beginning, it really looked like President Museveni would deliver on that promise. The Uganda he inherited was a failed state. The economy was shattered. The infrastructure was in ruins, and the country was deeply scarred by ethnic division and trauma. His first challenge wasn't just to rebuild a country, but to heal a society. His first moves were praised everywhere. He formed a broad-based government of national unity, inviting politicians from rival factions, even those he had just defeated, to join him. It was a masterstroke that helped calm the political tensions. He introduced a new system of governance he called the movement or no-party system. Museveni argued that Western-style parties in Uganda had only ever deepened ethnic and religious divides. Under the movement system, all Ugandans belonged to one political organisation, the National Resistance Movement, NRM. Political parties weren't banned, but their ability to hold rallies or sponsor candidates was severely restricted. For a while, many saw this as a pragmatic solution to Uganda's violent past. Museveni's most urgent task was restoring security. He began turning his guerrilla force, the NRA, into a national army, the UPDF. He worked to professionalise the military and curb the human rights abuses that had been the signature of past armies. And for most of the country, the change was dramatic. People could finally travel, farm their land, and sleep at night without fearing the soldiers meant to protect them. This return to basic law and order was maybe his single greatest achievement in those early years. With some stability in place, he turned to the economy. At first, he flirted with socialist policies. But facing a monumental task with limited resources, he quickly pivoted. Within a year, he embraced the market-oriented reforms pushed by the World Bank and the IMF. It was a pragmatic move. His government liberalised the economy, privatised inefficient state companies, and reined in government spending to control hyperinflation. It was bitter medicine, and it caused short-term pain, but it worked. The economy stabilised and then started to grow, averaging over 6% a year through much of the 90s. Uganda became a darling of international donors, held up as a model of post-conflict recovery. But perhaps nothing boosted Museveni's international reputation more than his response to the HIV/AIDS epidemic. In the 80s and 90s, when many world leaders were still silent, Museveni confronted the pandemic head-on. Uganda was one of the hardest-hit countries. Instead of hiding the problem, his government launched an open and aggressive public health campaign. He spoke about AIDS frankly, promoting a simple but effective ABC strategy: abstinence, be faithful, and use a condom. This political will produced stunning results. Uganda became one of the first African nations to successfully reverse its HIV infection rate, a success story hailed across the continent. By the mid-90s, Yoweri Museveni was at the height of his power and prestige. He was seen as a new kind of African leader, an intellectual, a disciplined reformer, a visionary. In 1995, a new constitution was created, which formalised his movement system but also set a 2-term limit for the presidency. The next year, in 1996, Uganda held its first direct presidential elections. Museveni won in a landslide with over 75% of the vote. It seemed the fundamental change was real. The liberator had earned his mandate. The fundamental change Yoweri Museveni had promised started to look very different as the years turned into decades. The man who had criticised African leaders for overstaying their welcome began to do the exact same thing. The shift from celebrated reformer to entrenched strongman wasn't sudden. It was a slow, methodical chipping away at the very democratic safeguards his own government had created. The first major crack appeared in the early 2000s. As Museveni's second and constitutionally final term drew to a close, a debate raged. Should the constitution be amended to remove presidential term limits? Behind the scenes, a campaign was underway. In 2005, against widespread opposition, the NRM-dominated parliament voted to scrap the limits. Just like that, the most important safeguard against a life presidency was gone. The path was now clear for Museveni to rule indefinitely. It was a seismic shift, a clear sign that power was becoming more important than the ideals of the revolution. Around the same time, the no-party movement system was officially ended, and Uganda returned to multi-party politics. But in reality, the playing field was anything but level. The NRM had spent 2 decades building its power, using state resources, and blurring the line between party and government. Opposition parties were weak, underfunded, and faced constant harassment. That harassment got worse with the rise of Museveni's first serious challenger, from within his own ranks, Dr. Kizza Besigye. A former personal physician to Museveni during the war, Besigye became a fierce critic of the president's growing authoritarianism. He ran against Museveni 4 times, and his political career became a case study in state repression. He has been arrested countless times on politically motivated charges. His rallies have been broken up with tear gas and live bullets. In a particularly brazen incident in November 2024, Besigye was abducted from Nairobi, Kenya, only to reappear days later in a Ugandan military court, facing security-related charges. The relentless persecution of Besigye sent a chilling message to anyone else who dared to mount a real challenge. The playbook used against Besigye was later deployed against a new generation of opponents. In the late 2000s, a charismatic challenger emerged from the music scene, Robert Kyagulanyi Ssentamu, the pop star known as Bobi Wine. His people power movement energized Uganda's massive youth population with a message of generational change. The state's reaction was swift and brutal. Like Besigye, Bobi Wine has been arrested multiple times, imprisoned, and charged with crimes like treason. His supporters have been met with deadly force. During the 2021 election campaign, dozens were killed in protests following his arrest. He has been tortured in military custody and often campaigns wearing a flak jacket and helmet. The message was clear. The space for political opposition was shrinking, and the Ikaye price of dissent was getting higher. With term limits gone, only one constitutional barrier remained to a life presidency, an age limit of 75. As Museveni approached this threshold, another crisis loomed. In 2017, a bill was introduced to scrap the age limit. The proposal triggered a firestorm. The parliamentary debate literally descended into a brawl, with opposition lawmakers fighting plainclothed security forces on the floor of the chamber. But the outcome was never really in doubt. The NRM-dominated parliament voted to remove the age limit. The final constitutional check on Museveni's power was gone. The liberator who came to power at 41 had now paved the way to rule into his 80s and beyond. The state itself was also transformed. The security apparatus, the police, the military, and a web of intelligence agencies became central to keeping the regime in power. The judiciary's independence was challenged, with security forces openly defying court orders. Human rights groups have documented a grim record of unlawful killings, forced disappearances, and torture, especially of opposition supporters. Laws like the Public Order Management Act have been used to crush peaceful assembly. The promise of a state that protected its citizens had been replaced by a state that viewed many of its own people as a threat. The iron fist, once used to forge a new nation, was now being used to crush dissent. While Uganda's politics became more restrictive, its economy kept growing, at least on paper. The numbers looked good. From total collapse in 1986, Uganda's GDP has grown substantially, now standing at over $50 billion. Museveni, who likes to call himself an economist-in-chief, has always used this economic progress as his main argument for staying in power. His early pro-market reforms brought in foreign investment and aid, funding the country's reconstruction. Over the decades, this has led to visible development, especially in the capital, Kampala. You can see new roads, dams, and buildings. The economy, once dependent on just coffee and cotton, has diversified, and now the government is banking on its newly discovered oil reserves to fuel the next stage of economic takeoff. But behind these headline figures is a more troubling reality. Economists point out that this has largely been jobless growth. Despite decades of expansion, the economy hasn't created nearly enough formal jobs for the hundreds of thousands of young people entering the workforce each year. This has led to a crisis of youth unemployment, with official statistics failing to capture the true scale of underemployment and disillusionment among graduates. This has created a large, frustrated, urban youth population, the core support base for opposition figures like Bobi Wine. The benefits of this growth also haven't been shared equally. A small, politically connected elite has become fantastically wealthy, while a huge portion of the population remains trapped in poverty. Corruption is endemic, siphoning off vast sums of public money that could be used for schools, hospitals, or job creation programs. On the world stage, Museveni has been a master of survival. In the 90s and 2000s, he was a key ally of the West, especially the US. His economic reforms and his role as a regional power broker made him an indispensable partner. Uganda became a crucial contributor to security in the region, most notably by sending peacekeepers to Somalia to fight al-Shabaab. This earned him political and financial support from Western powers, who often overlooked his democratic backsliding in favour of regional stability. He's also intervened directly in the region's conflicts. His army has fought in the Democratic Republic of Congo, facing accusations from the International Court of Justice of human rights abuses and the illegal plunder of resources. These interventions have made Uganda a major regional power, but have also entangled it in complex and volatile disputes. More recently, as Western criticism over his human rights record has grown, leading to some sanctions, Museveni has pivoted. He's nurtured closer ties with China and Russia, who offer investment without the preconditions about democracy. He's become a vocal critic of what he calls Western imperialism, championing a vision of African self-reliance, even as he depends on external financing for his government's projects. This skillful manoeuvring between global powers has helped him insulate his regime from pressure. The guerrilla fighter who once needed external support to start his revolution has become a master of using global rivalries to keep his grip on power. So we're left with two portraits of one man. There is Yoweri Museveni, the liberator, the man who, with 27 guns and an iron will, led a people's war against tyranny, the leader who pulled his nation from the brink of collapse, restored peace, and oversaw an economic recovery that was once unimaginable, the man who confronted the AIDS epidemic with courage, and who, for a time, was a beacon of hope for a new kind of African leadership. And then there is Yoweri Museveni, the strongman, the president who has systematically dismantled the very checks and balances designed to prevent a return to dictatorship, the ruler whose security forces are accused of arresting, torturing, and killing his political opponents, the leader who has clung to power for nearly 40 years, changing the constitution to fit his own ambition. Was this transformation inevitable? Did the young idealist get lost somewhere on the long road of power? Or were the seeds of the Iron Fist always there, hidden in the discipline and control needed to be a guerrilla commander? For millions of young Ugandans who have only ever known one president, the stories of liberation are ancient history. Their reality is one of high unemployment, shrinking freedoms, and a government that seems more focused on its own survival than on their future. For an older generation, the memory of the chaos that came before is still vivid. They remember the peace Museveni brought, and for many, that remains his defining legacy. The fundamental change he promised in 1986 did happen. Uganda is not the failed state it once was, but it also hasn't become the vibrant democracy many hoped for. It has settled into a hybrid system where the rituals of democracy exist, but the substance is often missing. The question that hangs over the Pearl of Africa now is what comes next. Museveni has secured his rule, but he won't rule forever, and his long reign has created a succession crisis with no clear answer. How will history judge Yoweri Museveni? As the man who saved Uganda from its past, or the man who mortgaged its future? Perhaps the tragedy and the truth is that he is both. What do you think? Is Museveni's legacy one of a liberator or a dictator? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this video informative, please like and subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into complex figures. And don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss an upload. Thank you for watching.